continuously. Our next speaker is David Cearley. David Cearley is Vice President and Gartner Fellow in Gartner Research, and he's a leading authority on information technology. As a futurist, he analyzes emerging business and technology trends and explores how these trends shape the way individuals and companies derive value from technology. His current research is focused on cloud computing and how internet and web technologies, standards, and business models are affecting the IT landscape. Please welcome David Cearley.
Thank you very much. I'm very, pardon me. I'm very pleased to be here today to share our ideas at Gartner about what's happening in the future. I was asked to come here and kind of challenge you a little bit, talk about what's happening not just in the next 12 months, but looking out 2, 3, 5 years, and even more than 5 years, and look at some of the emerging technologies and the emerging trends that we see shaping the market overall. Now, you heard the speaker earlier today talk about innovation, and I agree with a lot of the points that were made. Technology isn't going to automatically provide you innovation. It's what you do with the technology. It's how you apply it in various business contexts that's really critical. But then again, the technology oftentimes forms the building blocks. It may create an enabling environment that allows you to do new and different things. And so today, I'm going to focus on some of those technologies and how they're evolving in the marketplace. And I want to start with a quote from William Gibson. I'm a big science fiction fan. How many science fiction fans out there? You're NASA. Every hand should go up, right? You guys make it a reality versus science fiction. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I love that quote. There's a lot of things that I'll be talking about today that aren't brand new. They've been out there in various ways for quite some time. And what I want to focus on is where are some of the interesting targeted niche applications and how are those perhaps growing in the market and will enter more of the mainstream. So there's a lot of innovative things that are happening. There's a lot of new technologies and new techniques that are emerging. And what I want you to do is I want to challenge you to explore some of these emerging trends and technologies, look out onto the fringe, and ask yourself, what if? What do some of these technologies potentially hold for the world around you and for NASA in particular? You then, of course, have to identify barriers and problems and issues with these. And I could take any of the technologies I'm going to talk about today and give you the dark side, security and privacy implications and other problems. And I'll raise a few of those. But today, I'm going to shift a bit more to the what-if side. Where are the opportunities potentially in the future, and how do we see some of these things playing out? And I will, from time to time, inject a dose of practicality, and certainly what you can do today in this journey as well. So what I want to do is, over the next 45 minutes or so, is go through some top 10 strategic emerging trends. The first one that I want to look at is cloud computing. You've already heard a bit about cloud computing. We think this is going to be one of the most critical, fundamental shifts that's occurred in quite some time in the industry. But it's not something that just happens this year. It's something that's going to happen over the next 20 years. It's a long-term game. Jim talked about it as being end state. You've got to keep that in mind and then think, what are the steps along the way? So we'll give you my definition and where we see cloud computing going. I also want to talk a bit about social software. Now, social software has been around a while, but we see it entering some new phases. We've talked about Web 2.0 in the past. We've talked about social computing. What's happening in the future, and how does this notion of social computing combine with cloud computing to change the game? I want to look at next generation analytics. This is beyond the classic business intelligence and looking at data warehouses and internal applications. So where does analytics go in the future? Now, there's some immediate things, but we're going to also look out in the 2 to 10 year time frame. And then we're going to also look at mobile and real-world web. So if you look at those first, cloud computing, social software, next-generation analytics with predictive analytics underneath it, and mobile computing, those are some things that you can see out there today, and there's some real things that are happening in the market. So the beginning of the presentation is going to hit on those and talk about the long-term trend. And then we're going to get into things like the real-world web. How does the web move from being something in cyberspace to being embedded in the world around us? So we get into the world of context-aware computing, augmented reality, and future user interfaces that all combine with these previous trends to fundamentally change what's happening in the world. And let me tell you something. Some of you are tweeting out there in the audience. I'll give you a nice tweetable phrase right now. The PC era is over. It's 1981 again. What the heck do you mean by that, Dave? What I mean by that is in 1981, the IBM personal computer was released. That was an ignition point. We had personal computing and various enabling technologies out there for quite some time before. But from that ignition point, and from 1981 all the way up to the present, we had the PC era. And it wasn't just about individual PCs, but it was the way that it changed the way we thought about computing and pulled systems together. We talked about distributed computing and client server, and I would even say getting into the internet and the web was a way of linking these distributed systems together. When we start looking at mobile computing, for example, and some of these other enabling technologies that grow around it, we're seeing another sea change in the marketplace, where now it's shifting to a mobile environment and an embedded system model being the center of design, being the focal point if we look out certainly in the 5 to 10 year period, and we think even over the next few years. And a key ignition point for that has been the iPhone, the related App Store, and now the iPad, not just the iPad by itself, but this ignition point looking at more mobile computing in a very rich way. I'll talk more about that when we get into some of those things. But we think there is a fundamental change occurring, and it's going to bring together some of the items that I'm showing here that we'll talk about later. I'm going to finish up with a couple of items, if we've got time, that are much more futuristic: 3D printing, and then finally mobile robots, which we see as some very disruptive technologies having an impact more in the 5 to 10 or even beyond the 10-year planning cycle. Okay? And I'm sorry, fabric computing. I'll end up kind of bringing it back to how some of the infrastructure, the hardware systems are evolving as well with fabric computing. So first, let's look at cloud computing, and I'm going to start with a little bit of what's happening today and how we define cloud computing at Gartner, so we've got a baseline. At Gartner, I've actually been talking about cloud computing since it's actually about the past 4 years or so. We called it web platform to begin with, and as the term cloud computing caught on, it's really the same thing. So we're talking about a style of computing where scalable and elastic IT-related capabilities are provided as a service to customers using internet technologies. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to emphasize there that are particularly important when you're thinking about cloud computing. It significantly influences the way that you look at this. Number one is this idea of scalable and elastic IT capabilities. So you can scale up or down your access to these resources in a very rapid fashion. You can turn that rheostat, as Jim talked about earlier. So the idea of on-demand, dynamic, elastic services is fundamental. The second thing is this delivery as a service. And the fundamental point I want to get across here is that this creates an abstraction model between a consumer of cloud services and a provider of cloud services. And this is very, very important. A consumer of cloud services looks only at the service that's being delivered, a compute service, an application service for CRM, whatever the case might be. And they use that service. All of the details of the implementation behind the scenes, what kind of hardware, how automation is done, what sort of idle processes are in place, where the data centers exist, et cetera, are hidden from the user, hidden from the consumer, and only available through the service interface. So that's fundamental to this world of cloud computing that enables the provider to drive efficiencies in their implementation, and allows consumers to focus on just consuming the service and building things on top of it that they want. The reason I spend some time there is a lot of people are having problems with cloud computing because they start thinking about the implementation details. You only control things through the service interface. So those are two fundamental issues with cloud computing. Jim talked about the types of cloud computing services. I would agree the three fundamental services are infrastructure, platform, and software as a service. If you're looking at infrastructure as a service, instead of running on your data centers, you're running on data centers out in the cloud environment with compute and storage and similar things. When you move up to platform as a service, running database as a service or application development and runtime tools or what have you, you're abstracting more of the implementation. You abstract even more when you're dealing with the end application, like an end CRM application. So as you move up this stack, the provider does more and more, adds additional value in the implementation, and you as a consumer have to focus on, fewer and fewer issues. But I would say that you've also got to focus on these higher two services as well. We think it's important to look at information as a service, where what is actually delivered as a service is an information feed. Stock market information, catalog information, website traffic data. Those are all examples of information feeds, which are information services. And then finally, this intersects with the world of business services. So something like ADP as a payroll service or many other business services, the world of business process outsourcing that you look at today, moving into cloud, delivers these things as a service. So why do we even talk about those things? We've had business services like ADP and payroll forever. The reason is that when you start thinking of these technology-driven things as a service, you start blending all of these worlds together. And so as you create your composite business models of the future, you'll be able to pull together information sources, business services where people work on your behalf, applications that your people use internally, infrastructure components that you build upon to create your overall environment, and that can shift over time. Also what happens, you heard a little bit earlier about security and some of the business models. I would contend that some of the things that we've looked at with business services and defining the relationship between a business service provider and a business service consumer will start migrating down. We've thought of all of these things underneath too much as technologies today. And so people want to specify the technology implementation or where that server runs. Rather than that model, I think what's going to evolve here, what you need to think about is the evolution of business service levels. So a business service level might require, I want compute services and the data stored on or a storage service, and the data stored has to stay in the political jurisdiction of origin. So that's the way you specify the service requirement, and then your provider will implement that. So we're seeing some interesting evolution in each of these areas. One of the other things to think about in terms of cloud computing is how you get your hands around dealing with cloud computing. Because people talk about private clouds and you're building your own clouds and you're building applications and I'm consuming Amazon services, etc. It gets very confusing. We think cloud computing breaks down into three parallel related initiatives. Number one, consuming cloud services. So you have these types of services on the left, and I'm going to consume them. We think of that oftentimes as public services like from Amazon or Microsoft or others. I'll talk in the next slide about consuming certain private cloud services that they might provide as well. Second is implementing cloud computing environments. You've done that with Nebula and some things within NASA where you've implemented a cloud computing environment. The important thing is the first one, it's not about the implementation details, it's all about consuming the services and how you build on top of it. The second focal point is how you act as a provider and build the underlying infrastructure. And let me tell you, it's a lot more than just virtualization, as many of you in the audience know that have worked on building your own environment. There's automation, there's provisioning technologies, there's operations management, there's a lot that has to go into implementing a cloud environment. It's not an off-the-shelf exercise. And then third is developing cloud-based applications and solutions. And this is the one that's more emerging today. There's work around using Hadoop or OData models, doing other distributed processing and grid-type computing models. But we're at the beginning of that. We think this heats up very much by 2012 with mainstream companies focusing on building new types of high-performance computing environments that they couldn't necessarily do cost-effectively or efficiently with the existing models. So think of high-performance computing and distributed processing moving out into the mainstream. So those are three primary focal points. And if there's a D on that list, another thing that you want to think about is most enterprises will not simply be consuming cloud services, implementing environments, and building cloud applications. You will be a cloud service provider. Most businesses may be delivering cloud information services or application services or business services that link in through a cloud model. You won't necessarily be providing those first two models in most cases. But companies will be cloud service providers as well. Now, the next thing I want to look at will relate back to something that you heard about Azure and some of the Azure appliances. And I want you to think about cloud computing delivery models along this spectrum. Over the next 5 years, this spectrum will be filled out in a very rich fashion. The far right-hand side looks at public cloud computing, where basically anybody with a credit card or the ability to log on to a site can access to that particular public cloud service. Amazon is the poster child for a public cloud computing service. The far left-hand side looks at custom private cloud. Your Nebula environment is a custom private cloud. So you define the architecture and the implementation details and everything else. Guess what? When I talk to Exxon, they're building their own private custom cloud environment, and they've made their own decisions on the implementation details and the operations mechanisms and how they're going to use virtualization, et cetera. So the far right has the maximum amount of leverage of what the back-end vendor can do, gives the consumer a lot of flexibility. The custom private cloud moves towards a more efficient environment for your infrastructure and applications, but you give up the scale that you can get to with some of these public cloud efforts. So there's a trade-off between the two. What's even more important is these three models in the middle are going to be increasingly viable. Managed private cloud is an example of the Azure appliance. So rather than defining your own architecture, you go to a provider, typically a provider who has some of these other cloud services, and you say, I want that implementation, I want to run it in my site, and they may manage it for you as well. So they operate that as a managed service. We'll see how much Dell or Microsoft and others do to actually manage that for you. But at a minimum, they'll provide you that architecture so you can leverage what somebody else is doing. Microsoft is being more aggressive in positioning that today. Do not expect to see them as the only one. When we look at the paths that IBM and many other cloud vendors are on, we see this managed private cloud model in their future as well. Some of the traditional web players like Google, probably not. But Amazon, a bit on the fence. You could potentially see that in the future. But what you'll more likely see from somebody like an Amazon is a virtual private cloud and a community cloud. On a virtual private cloud, the vendor essentially carves off in a dynamic fashion part of their environment. So at any given point in time, you're running on a dedicated set of servers in a walled-off environment versus everybody else running in their cloud environment. Imagine if Amazon could wall off part of their data center and say those systems are only for you, but yet dynamically add servers and reduce servers and storage to that pool at any given point in time. What you've essentially done is change the level of granularity and sharing from a virtual machine to entire machines. So that gives you some additional security and control. And community private clouds are looking at a way of limiting cloud computing so that only people that are a member of a particular community, it might be an industry or it might be a named group of people, have access to that. So as we look at this, there's different levels of ownerships and access, et cetera. The more you go to the left, the more secure you can make that environment, and the more controlled it is, but the less leverage that you've got. So the bottom line that you need to be thinking about over the next 5 years is how you create hybrid cloud computing environments that will mix and match various elements across this so that based upon the data, based upon the applications that you need to deliver, you can deploy in any one of those different models. So life gets complicated in the future with more cloud computing options, not less. The other thing that I wanted to focus on with cloud computing is this idea of service brokerage. Now, the idea of brokerage or having some sort of intermediary in the world of IT is not new. We've looked at that with systems integrators and others. But the world of cloud computing, where you have all of these services that are out there, makes this need for a third-party intermediary even greater, grows significantly. So what we're talking about with brokerage is this is really a business model where an entity adds value to one or more services for one or more customers. There's a variety of enabling technologies that they might use, but what I really want to focus on are some of these broker categories in the middle. One is aggregation. We're seeing the evolution of vendors that will provide aggregation services to pull together services from multiple vendors. There's arbitrage, so vendors that will provide a third party and provide arbitrage across perhaps multiple cloud infrastructure service providers or multiple cloud application providers and move things between different providers based upon performance needs, pricing, etc. Context, we see context brokers, and you'll hear me talk more about ContextAware Computing later, but these are providers that will provide some sort of context to the delivery of the service and then drive the performance of services around a particular end user or business context. Customization and enhancement, fit into this as well, where you have third parties that will enhance or extend this environment. Think of it as security enhancements or additional performance enhancements or governance mechanisms around the access to services. And then finally, you've got integration, which is classic integration, pulling multiple services together, and finally, insurance, where you see providers that are taking some of the business risk of accessing things from multiple service providers. So an insurance brokerage provider, for example, might say, we've vetted these following providers, and we have contracts and mechanisms in place to guarantee the movement of data back and forth between these different providers, so we can provide a level of insurance around a business process that's higher than the original service provider. And so we'll take on higher risk, we'll give you higher business level assurance, okay? So the reason I've got this up there and this idea of looking into the future is that this is a nascent market now. Things are just beginning to gel together. You see people like StrikeIron that are providing aggregation of information services, bringing credit information together. Or Jamcracker that's providing service integration and aggregation across different SaaS providers. There's Sona Systems that are providing some governance mechanisms that let you govern access to various services. And when we talk with the various telecommunication providers and systems integrators and professional services firms, they're all looking at how they provide services to you in a cloud environment that can help ease the consumption and integration and use of cloud computing. So this is going to be one of the most rapidly growing markets, and as you get into cloud computing and look at the complexity of dealing with lots of services, the need for value-added service brokers is growing significantly. I want to shift now to another trend that's been around for the past few years, but it's continuing to grow, and that's this area of social software. I want to talk about some of the next stages that we're going on in the journey. So you've already been looking at blogs and wikis and a variety of ways of using social software. There's Facebook and MySpace and various public sites that are out in the market. So internal collaboration is one area that you're going to continue to focus on social software. Consumer-led innovation and adoption is going to continue. And the shift now is into what we call social communication and collaboration. So what we've seen oftentimes in the past is social software has been somewhat disconnected from some of the traditional email and collaboration efforts. What you're going to increasingly see over the next 3 to 5 years is unified communication and collaboration intersecting with social software. So think of it as unified social communication and collaboration. It's a broad environment. And go back to what Jim was talking about on some of those major trends. I agree with that. What he had with unified communication and collaboration is a key enabler, but it's social too. And we, in fact, are seeing a lot of the vendors starting to bring these things together into some more unified suites. Now, I don't want to go down that whole rat's nest of the vendor selection. You're not going to go to just one vendor and one suite for everything. It'll be a more heterogeneous environment. But it's a trend of the major vendors, trying to bring these things together that is important. So that's what I want you to think about going forward. Don't think about unified communication, collaboration, and social over here. They come together as a way of driving your internal environment. One of the other things that has been around for a while but we think begins to increase is this focus on crowdsourcing and collective intelligence. Now, when we talk about crowdsourcing, we're talking about using the collective, using the community, using the external social network as a source of information, as a source of innovation. For example, look at the Netflix prize that they had out for a few years and then awarded last fall. You know, they had a lot of smart people internally driving their recommendation engine. They got to a point of diminishing returns. They opened up the Netflix prize and say, we're going to have $1 million to somebody who can increase the performance of our algorithms by greater than 10%, and came out with some various details of how they were going to measure that. That was important to them because it drives their business differentiation. And over the course of a couple of years, you had a lot of smart people externally pound on this, come up with some pretty sophisticated algorithms, and then, you know, a team won the prize and improved their algorithm. That's only one example. There's Innocentive and many others that are out there that are doing crowdsourcing. We see this as something that's going to increase significantly over the next few years as a source of innovation. You and NASA are familiar with some of the, essentially the crowdsourcing models with people looking at star maps and things of that sort. You crowdsource and they look at this information, and I think I read something recently, somebody using one of those found a pulsar somewhere. You know, so you're not, you know about some of this, but look at it being used in more and more places. Finally, knowledge management reborn. Knowledge management has gone through the hype cycle, up through the height of hype, and has crashed into what we call the trough of disillusionment, and has been firmly entrenched there for quite some time. And one of the reasons why is that knowledge management wanted to come up with all these tagging mechanisms and rules and everything. So we capture and we organize and we control it, and none of us wanted to have anything to do with that. And so there was an inherent problem. What's happening, though, is as you get these social networks growing up, you have people using social media to contribute content, to add tags, you add other information. You have tacit knowledge that can be captured as a side effect of this whole social communication and collaboration environment. So we short-circuit this. We create, we have it dynamically model it itself, we access it, and we use it. And there can be a little bit of organization behind the scenes. But we see this model really starting to unlock the knowledge within a lot of organizations. And that leads us to the next step, which is starting to become important, which is social analysis. When we look at social analysis, we're talking about an umbrella term that looks at measuring, analyzing, and interpreting the results of interactions and associations between people and various information sources. It really breaks down into 4 key areas you need to be thinking about. Number 1, social network analysis, defining social networks, getting information about those networks to identify how people are collaborating with one another. You can then feed that back into the social network or feed it into improving other business processes. Social filtering, sentiment analysis, and social media analysis all fit into here as well. Sentiment analysis is one in particular that's growing quite dramatically, so you're measuring the sentiment around a particular company or around some sort of activity. So we're seeing a lot of commercial institutions especially bringing social analysis into their broader analytics environment. So that brings us actually to the next item on the list, which is next generation analytics. We see this becoming more collaborative, more predictive, more real-time, more embedded. If you look at the kind of evolution or the stages that companies are going through in the whole business intelligence and analytics world, it goes through 3 phases. You know, so what happened, dealing with classic reporting and dashboarding. Why did it happen, which gets you into ad hoc query and OLAP and data mining issues. And then finally, what will happen in the future, which gets us into this world of predictions and predictive analytics that we've looked at for the last few years and we see continuing to mature in the future. But what's actually interesting is you take that world of predictive analytics and you marry it with 2 other trends as well. First of all, going from explanatory to predictive, but we also move from traditional offline analytics to inline and embedded analytics. So analytics is not something else you go do on the side simply, but it's embedded in the business processes. You see that happening with the commercial vendors like SAP and Oracle and others, and it's being used much more widespread as well. So embedding predictive analytics within the context of business processes lets you drive better decisions. And when we do our CIO surveys every year, this issue of using information more effectively, driving better business decisions, always comes in as 1, 2, or 3 on the list of key business priorities. And embedding it in those business processes is one way that you can do that. However, there's still a problem. Too often with these analytics tools, you've got to be some sort of rocket scientist to figure out how to do it, or model it, or build these algorithms, do this predictive analytics. So this other dimension is critically important as well, which is a shift from just high-end expert tools to embedding analytics into real human beings' everyday processes. So search as a key tool, as an entry point for analytics, coming up with collaborative analytics environments so that you may have people building algorithms and building blocks in the back end, but putting that into a collaborative environment so you can have financial professionals and business professionals and others come together in a collaborative analytics space is an important trend. We're seeing a number of people beginning to build these types of environments. Oftentimes they're custom created with individual enterprises, but where they're coming out, they're having tremendous value. Some of the major BI vendors like IBM are starting to build this idea of collaborative along with predictive analytics into their systems. And the key here with this dimension is it starts making analytics much more accessible. There's a variety of related and enabling trends. I talked about social and BI convergence and BI search. There's also this idea of data mashups. When you can bring information and data from disparate sources in real time together and analyze that, you can drive significant value. So the ability to do that with end user tools to drive these data mashups, we think is going to be increasingly important and is married together with in-memory analysis. Here's a side note here. Here's another interesting thought. In 5 years, will we still be using a lot of disk? Or might we be putting a lot more in memory? Take a look at the systems that are coming out today that have a terabyte or more of memory associated with a blade. Take a look at where that path goes over the next 5 or 6 years. And we suddenly have systems with massive amounts of memory, so that doing some of these data mashups in memory start to become very viable. Also, by the way, it starts being viable in many cases to bring your operational database and your data warehouse or analytic database together and have them in one in-memory data structure. Wow, that's powerful as well. If you don't have to have a different data schema for my OLTP and my analytic world, I can bring those together, one data structure, and do a lot more real-time data analytics driving business processes. So data mashups and in-memory analysis starts bringing this world of analytics into an even more real-time world. Columnar databases and cloud analytics services start empowering this as well. Bottom line here, though, is that through 2012, 20% of organizations will have the skills and maturity necessary to fully exploit this next generation analytics. That means 80% won't. How do you make sure that you're part of the 20%? That's not a technology issue. That's a skills issue. It's understanding where you are on that maturity curve in the upper left. Doing the blocking and tackling around getting a handle on your data and information and putting it in usable forms, and then looking at some of these extended tools to get a handle on that. So this is going to be something that we're going to see a lot of evolution in the market over the next 5+ years, and it's going to be some interesting new technologies, but also important processes as well. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump by the detail on predictive analytics, and I want to go to this world of mobile computing. This is the fourth area we're looking at. And first of all, we're pretty familiar with lots of different mobile devices that are out there. We've got our BlackBerries, or at least some of us have our BlackBerries. I predict she'll have a BlackBerry before the end of the day from somebody here in the audience. BlackBerries, the iPhones, the iPad that's come out, the Kindle. So there's an explosion of these mobile form factors. So how does this affect you? Well, mobile is becoming a major design point for more applications. We're seeing an explosion in the use of tablet. As I said earlier, the era of the PC is over. That doesn't mean the PC goes away, but this tablet form factor and the multi-touch interface and the way that people are interfacing with data and applications through that type of a device will have a disruptive impact and change the PC and the notebook. It'll have an impact on our phones and our smartphones as well. So just as the PC revolution caused the mainframe to change into a big server, the mobile revolution is going to cause the PC and other things to grow into a specialized type of mobile interface. So mobile, I would predict over the next few years, the things we think about around mobile and tablets today will be your primary design point. And then that desktop unit just becomes a fixed function subset of what you could do, in the mobile computing world. Now, more on how this mobile world expands a little bit later. Mobile apps are a critical enabler for business to consumer interactions. That's one of the reasons why, from a business standpoint, this is going to be driven more and more rapidly. ContextAware Computing begins to enter your planning. More about this later, but the point here is location-based services that are delivering through mobile devices is a type of context. So my location is part of the context as I'm using this device. And so the application delivery management and support complexity will increase with this. There's no unified single platform for building in the mobile world. If I want to build an iPhone app, that's not going to run on Android. So I have a fragmenting of that market versus what I've seen in the PC desktop. So there's lots of challenges here, and there's some things that are going to slow it down as a result in different areas. But we think this is an inexorable trend. One other side note to point out here. Look at what's happening just on the x86 architecture overall. We used to grow it with Moore's law to create more and more massive x86 chips. Now what are we doing? We're putting more and more cores together, so it's a multi-core system. A side effect of that is the individual core is getting made smaller and smaller and smaller, and so we now get to where we can essentially put the single core x86 on these little handheld devices, and that's going to go more and more. That trend starts to actually bring together some of what we see on the desktop and the mobile world as well. So a number of trends come together here. Last thing that I want to challenge you with here on the mobile side, and I'll have a few slides to go into it in detail, is the App Store, the rise of the application store. Now, app stores have actually been around for quite a number of years, but they've become much more important, and they will become much more important in the future because they give rise to the emergence of the entrepreneur. I'm an analyst. We like to make up words. What can I say? So where did this come from? The etymology is application developer and entrepreneur. What we're talking about is somebody who authors applications and delivers them through virtual, context-specific application stores and marketplaces rather than traditional software distribution channels. It's amazing. You got high school kids building iPhone applications and making $15,000, over their summer vacation because they did a "Is it Friday yet?" application. You have lots of individuals that are being empowered with this to build all sorts of applications. And that in the App Store with the iPhone isn't just about the iPhone. That same model then people are applying elsewhere. So it's really about mobile devices, the browser, social networks, an application platform. Look at what's happening on Facebook as an example. This is an important new phenomenon that is just as important as what we saw with the revolution in the PC era. Suddenly, I didn't have to own a giant mainframe. I could buy a PC and build my software and start delivering applications. I was back there in 1981. We used to deliver software in a little baggie with a disk and typewritten documentation, with a company that had 8 of us. That same kind of thing is beginning to reignite in this marketplace. We're seeing it already. It's already happening. Seeing it with Facebook, see it with LinkedIn. There's iPhone and iPad applications, and there's also this growing world of the web and cloud platforms. And what I'm showing here is Google Apps Marketplace, App Exchange with software with Salesforce.com, and the Microsoft web environment. In fact, Microsoft is growing an environment for information content exchange as well. So people that have information services can come up with a way of analyzing or putting information together and not just sell an application, but they're an entrepreneur on selling an information feed through some of these marketplaces. So you see companies like Zynga. Who knows that company? Heard of Zynga? Z-Y-N-G-A? Anybody use Facebook out there? Oh, come on, you got to admit it, use Facebook. Well, if you use some of those social games, Farmville and some of those, Zynga grew up creating games that went on some of these social sites. You know, small company, grew up over the past few years. They're now worth billions of dollars based upon the latest venture round funding. So this is unlocking an enormous amount of innovation. Don't underestimate how this is going to drive different aspects of the market. So what is the perspective for government and enterprises? Well, government enterprise has three big interests. Number one, acquiring software themselves in a manner similar to consumers. So where do you buy and use these things? And even if you don't have an official corporate policy to buy and use them, I guarantee that all those folks that are using the Android, that are using the iPad, that are using the iPhone, they're using those applications, they're using them in a business context. So what's out there and how do we use it? Getting your hands around that and some governance mechanisms is going to be important. Enabling internal programmers and your citizen developers to build and deliver solutions using the tools of the entrepreneur is important. So you may want to begin looking at what sort of tools do we put in place to build those sorts of applications which are delivered in that model. Do we need an internal app store that goes out to our users? Of course, you can't do that with the iPhone. That gets us into a whole nother discussion with the issue of Apple's rather controlling environment. But we see over time that some of these special extensions to the App Store for businesses will in fact exist, so that you'll have a way of essentially for your users adding apps to some of these different app stores. And then engaging constituents in the marketplace where they play, putting them in competition with the entrepreneur. So you delivering information to your constituents out there will be competing with other individual entrepreneurs that are in the market, but you also want to perhaps look at how you empower them. So you want to expose business data and processes and let the community take over, so leverage the ecosystem. What sort of web-oriented architecture, APIs, and XML structures do you want to make available? Now, you know about this already. You've embraced web-oriented architecture. There's all sorts of interesting information that you make available to the public in some of these manner. So that's a starting point. We think that's going to get even bigger. And then, of course, this isn't as simple as build it, then they will come. There's lots of issues on how you're going to manage this and how you'll govern it. But it's a very real groundswell phenomena that we see in the market. The next thing I want to talk about is this world of the real world web. This is moving beyond mobile to the world of ubiquitous computing. So what real world web does is links the physical world to the virtual world. You connect to places and things. We're seeing some examples of this already where you have automobiles that are tweeting their status, or appliances or other real-world objects that are using tweets or other information feeds to make their status known. You're seeing other embedded systems that, like you see down here. This one on the left is an egg. So you can put this in a crate of eggs, move it around through the supply chain, it collects information, and then you can get some data on the environmental factors and perhaps go back and address issues that are causing breakage or spoilage of eggs. Or a similar type of thing on the right-hand side, looking at measuring the environmental factors. So environmental monitoring is a big one that we're starting to see. We're seeing that in shipping, in intelligent buildings more and more in the future. Greater sensor networks grow as part of this as well. And in fact, we've seen some very interesting leading edge examples, say an oil and gas company using literally millions of sensors that they drop into a zone where they're doing some seismic analysis for oil exploration, getting data from all of that, and they have multiple orders of magnitude improvement in the quality of the data that they're getting examining those fields because of the sensor network that they've put out. So there's a lot of high value opportunities that are coming out here. One of the other things that's happening is as technology, traditional IT technology, gets embedded in a lot of these operational systems around us, you have a linkage of information technology management and operations technology management. So we need to bring together some of those worlds. We'll oftentimes begin to use the IT tools for software management and change management, et cetera, over in some of these operational areas. Because instead of being these sort of dedicated, proprietary, encapsulated systems, those operating technologies now might be running Microsoft Windows or Linux and other more dynamic systems. So that raises some significant challenges in a lot of industries where these embedded assets are part of this overall world. So the bottom line, look for the digital and the real world coming together. It becomes not cyberspace, but all space, the real world web. Now, I mentioned context-oriented computing a few times already. When we look at context-aware computing, we can think of this growing in a few ways. What we're talking about with context is information about people, about processes, about location that augments the user interface. It makes the delivery of information or application components more robust. Now, the classic model here, pre-context, is presence or personal information data. What we're seeing emerge now in the 2010 to 2012 timeframe are simple systems and walled gardens. So we have more location-based services, identity services, simple behavior and habits, mining information from social networks, and driving simple proactive alerts. So we get more contextual information to change the way that the system will respond to the user. So context becomes embedded more and more. What you should plan on in the 2015 to 2020 timeframe is a much more robust context delivery architecture. That's a new architectural model that you're going to hear more about and start thinking about over the next 5 years. Context delivery architecture. So there's more sensors and biosensors and adjacent devices and more complex federated services. To handle all of this, you need to start thinking about how you bring together a structured way of looking at context information, defining the formats, defining the APIs to have access to that, relating the information sources to one another. So the context-aware computing and the emergence of context delivery architectures becomes increasingly important over the next few years. What this leads us to is something that starts bringing a lot of this together. So think of the cloud, and we have all of these services out there that are in the cloud that we can get access to in a dynamic fashion and start pulling together to create composite business processes and composite services. We have a mobile computing environment and an embedded ubiquitous computing real-world web that has the world around us joined together in a more connected fashion. We have a lot of contextual information about the services that are out there and about individuals and what their preferences are. What this brings us towards is this idea of augmented reality or information in context. Now, we think this is a large, long-term opportunity. It's been steadily increasing. It's not, brand new. We've used augmented reality with heads-up displays and things of that sort, for some time. But we think that over the last few years, with the things that we've seen in the mobile marketplace, with GPSs, with digital compasses, with cameras and image processing, accelerometers, all of that is starting to make the world of augmented reality much more of a reality. So context information is at the point of decision point or action. The example on the left up there is Nokia's Point and Find. So taking this out, pointing it to a building or something else and having information pop up on the screen. There's a reality browser out there called Layar that does something similar. So the camera shows you a picture of what's through and it looks like a magic window and will give you some information that's pulled from various information sources to tell you about what you're looking at. So you can imagine that used, for example, by an electrician going into a building that has access to the schematics and showing a wall and saying, okay, that's where the power is coming down, in the wall. So there are some very practical examples of what you can do when you start bringing some of these technologies that are out there together right now. One of the other key enablers, by the way, is the availability of the overlay data. That goes back to what I talked about earlier with social networking, because that overlay data is coming from lots of structured classic sources, but it's a lot of individuals putting information into various systems on what's at different locations and other information about it as well. So the social content is part of this. The one on the upper right is an example of a MIT project called Sixth Sense. So what you've got there is a wearable computer. That's quite a fashion statement, isn't it? I think if Apple got a hold of this, they might change it around a bit. But the idea is he's got this wearable computer, with a camera and with a projection. And so what this will do is actually project onto real-world objects in front of you. Here you see it projecting something onto a newspaper. So you're reading the newspaper, it identifies that you're reading the newspaper, it can pull some information from that newspaper site and perhaps give you some audio and other additional information about that. Or identify the article that you're looking at and pull some news from other sources. So you can think of a lot of cases where you can bring some of these things together. This is an experimental idea, but this idea of bringing together what's happening in the real world to augment the world around us with digital information, not just go to some sort of virtual reality world, will be increasingly viable over the next 5 years. And this was done, by the way, Sixth Sense, with inexpensive, off-the-shelf technologies. Now, there's an interesting set of evolutions occurring in the user interface overall. So I started talking a bit about the user interface with the idea of augmented reality. There's a lot I could talk about with the man-machine interface, the whole I/O model with speech recognition and handwriting recognition, gesture recognition, multi-touch displays that I mentioned earlier, and there's lots of cool things happening in all those areas. I'll mention multi-touch real quickly. Multi-touch isn't just about using that iPad and moving your fingers around, but in fact there's a lot of interesting multi-touch research out there from Microsoft and others creating Surface computers. We also have a couple of companies that have created some very interesting films that can go around objects to create a multi-touch interface on existing objects, whether it's across a window or on some curved shaped object, creating a multi-touch interface there. So lots of things evolving there. But one area that a lot of people aren't talking about that I wanted to challenge you with is the Z factor, computing in 3 dimensions. So when we look at this, there's various 3D input models. I've listed some of them here with 3D cameras and gesture control, or things like digital clay with an evolving interface where as you shape a clay object or operate with that, it interprets that into a user interface to create a 3D model on the system itself. There's much more happening in 3D design tools. Virtual worlds, I wouldn't count them out totally, although they are deeply in the trough of disillusionment right now. So there's more happening in some processing areas, but the virtual worlds actually only will start creeping out and become important when they move away from a proprietary model and start coming up with a standards-driven open model like the web itself. And when you start getting a lot of overlay data that's available that can be consumed by those worlds. So ironically, more happening with virtual reality and bringing the real world web together will create some new opportunities in the future for virtual worlds. There's more with 3D displays, and then ultimately this idea of programmable matter, which is a DARPA research project to create self-assembling types of systems. So look at this 3D interface, and this is going to be the next level beyond some of the things that people are talking about with basic multi-touch and gesture displays today. Most of this is going to have a bigger impact, well, some of it in the near term with the scanners, but some of the longer term things are really in the 10+ year time frame. But the point is, don't think that our work on user interfaces is over. What is this leading towards? Well, what it's leading towards is in the 2015 to 2020 period, we have what we call the fluid user interface. We have intelligent devices all around us. Everything is connected. Everything is a service. There's a myriad of I/O options. There's context information available. And so what we have is the user experience becomes a disconnected from an individual device or an individual application. The focus is on a fluid user experience, so you can have ensemble interactions involving many devices. So I've got my iPad, my iPhone, my desktop, my television set, and other types of displays, and the environment is the computer. And so I bring all of those things together, and based upon the context with what I have around me, the system will react differently. So the user interface isn't something that's just to the device, it's a model that goes across multiple devices. Interactions shift to the appropriate device. We have much more contextual interactions, lots with sensors and control mechanisms, and emotionally aware interactions as well. There's actually a thread that we look at, which is mind-computer interface and emotional interfaces. There's actually some interesting early systems. Actually, some of them are being implemented in toys and games right now, for example. So I can stare at this little ball that's in this column, and by concentrating or relaxing, move it up and down the column. A simple mind-machine type of interface. Why is such a toy important? Well, the reason it's important is because they have, rather than the classic EKG models to try and do some mind-machine interfaces, some vendors have come up with much easier and inexpensive ways to do it. Emotion detection that will identify features and tell if people are happy or sad or other things are starting to emerge as well. So look at those things coming into this fluid user interface with the environment as a computer as well. So that's your end state. That's where things are getting, but not for probably a 5 to 10 year period. In the near term, think of the user experience platform that's growing out of the things that I talked about so far. It's the next step for portal and mashup markets. Think of this really as portal plus mashup plus social plus mobile. All of those things coming together into an environment to build my user experience. Okay? Notice we don't say user interface. It's the user experience that's overall. And there's lots of individual user interaction technologies that you can see in here. Tools to build and validate it are growing. This is not a market yet. There are people coming to this market. Watch this space. I can't talk about what some major vendors are doing, but in the next 2 to 3 months, you will see the emergence of what is essentially user experience platforms packaging some of the portal, social networking, and mobile components together to create these next generation interfaces. Finally, though, here, although I emphasize the technology part in this pitch, user experience design is more important than just the platform. Now, I want to finish up on the last few very quickly and have a couple of minutes for questions. 3D printing. This has been around for a while to do rapid prototyping. It's becoming increasingly inexpensive and the quality's been going up. There's different ways that you can do that. This source with Z Corporation here is a model. It's almost like a inkjet printer. It uses a powdery mechanism and puts together a binder so you can build things up and create these three-dimensional objects. But what's happening is what used to cost $200,000 now costs $20,000 or $10,000 in the next year or so, and probably $5,000 and then $2,500 and then under $1,000 in the subsequent years in the planning period. As this happens, we're going to see 3D printing used more and more for other types of things, more in terms of architectural models, hobbyists, and artists. The biggest drawback that we see to this really is one that's a material science problem. There's only a few sets of materials and certain things that you can actually create with these. So you can do simple fabrication of plastic parts and things of that sort, but you can't, tell it to fab a, microchip or something like that, or anything very complex. And so that's sort of the what-if factor. If we make some breakthroughs in certain material sciences and how you can build things or combine different materials together in 3D printing, then we'll see something very, very interesting to see take off. And also the DARPA Programmable Matter program, feeds into this as well. If you start adding the 3D printing concept with programmable matter, we don't quite get to the replicators out of Star Trek, but we're getting probably as close as we can think about getting. Mobile robots drive mobile infrastructure. Mobile is an interesting one to look at as well with robots. There's a lot of things that people are looking at with these humanoid robots and things of that sort. But what I want to focus you on that we think is very interesting is mobile video conferencing as an example. So this idea of mobile robots bringing the robots in different areas to drive value through other types of interactions is important. So in healthcare, for example, we're seeing robots that are mobile video conferencing robots that can go into a patient's room. So a doctor that might be in another hospital and has a few minutes can use that to have a video conference with the patient. What we're finding in studies, in fact, is that those patients actually like that because they would rather talk with their doctor for the 15 minutes rather than just somebody at the hospital, and that doctor then can deal with multiple patients that might be in multiple hospitals. We're also seeing this used in different warehouse situations. Staples is using this as an interesting example. So picking and packaging things for shipment is a problem for robots to do today, but robots can actually bring things to a person, so to create a dynamic pick and pack station, which is what we're seeing down below. So a lot happening with mobile robots. And I want to finish up then with something that's a little more practical and near term, but also with long-term implication, and that's this idea of computing fabrics. Computing fabrics in the near term are really individual vendors bringing server storage, networking, and memory into tightly coupled environments, but where you can do a lot of virtualization between those different parts. Longer term, we see almost a disaggregation of these different systems. So imagine if I had these two rack systems available, and I could say, I want to have system A, I dynamically pull 2 processors, a little bit of memory, and some I/O. For application B, I want a couple of processors, more memory, and 1 I/O. For another need, I'm going to go across these 2 blades or across these 2 racks and get lots of processors and memory and I/O. So based upon the application need, you dynamically assemble the resources needed for a virtual server for that need. When the need goes away, the resources go back to the pool and can be used elsewhere. That's the long-term evolution that we see with the server environments today. This is driven by what you need in enterprise, but it's also driven by a model to really make the next level of cloud computing work for the cloud vendors as well. So you heard Jim talk about some of the stuff with Dell earlier. So with that, I'll leave you with one final quote. When it comes to the future, there are 3 kinds of people: those who let it happen, those who make it happen, and those who wonder what happened. What kind are you? Thanks. With that, time for one question?